When people refer to the greatest album of all time, people tend to lean towards the obvious choices. Dark Side of the Moon, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, Purple Rain, or Thriller. Some may regard some of the slightly lesser-known all-time classics like Kind of Blue, What's Going On, and Rumors, or some may even go as far as to say that more recent releases can be considered in that echelon of quality, like To Pimp a Butterfly, In Rainbows, and a personal choice of mine, I Let It In and It Took Everything. But most people probably would never consider qualifying an album that technically doesn't exist. But I think that one of those albums should count. The Beach Boys never finished SMiLE. It nearly killed its main songwriter, Brian Wilson. It caused a rift in the band that resulted in Brian Wilson ceasing to be the group's main visionary. And I think that it is unequivocally the greatest album of all time. In 1961, in a little suburb of Hawthorne, California, 3 brothers, 1 cousin, and 1 friend started a band that would soon capture the attention of the entire world and launch careers that led to success, fame, fortune, tragedy, despair, loss, faith, and acceptance. This little group that could was called the Beach Boys. The Beach Boys' output is more than double that of the Beatles, spanning 5 decades and providing hundreds of classic songs to those who decide to seek them out. But that's really the thing. Why is it that the Beach Boys' output is hardly ever recognized by the general public as much other than silly surf music about cars, beaches, and girls? And I'm asking this to you if you're not super familiar with the Beach Boys. What song do you think of when I say the Beach Boys? Is it Surfin' Safari? Is it Kokomo? Is it In My Car? Is it Help Me Rhonda? Maybe Good Vibrations or Heroes and Villains? Sure, those are great songs, and for years, that's all I thought about when I heard the name The Beach Boys. I knew that they rivaled the Beatles for a period of time, but I also knew that Brian Wilson had a mental breakdown at some point during the 60s, and according to my mom, he was, and I quote, a bit of a nut job. Rock and roll history is littered with tragedy and thousands of what ifs. What if the Beatles never broke up? What if Syd Barrett was able to have continued with Pink Floyd? What if Stevie Ray Vaughan didn't die so prematurely? What if Hendrix survived his drug-induced night? What if the Beach Boys had released SMiLE? SMiLE, for those not aware, was the Beach Boys' follow-up to their critically acclaimed Pet Sounds, an album that significantly changed the face of rock music. It incorporated orchestral and unconventional instruments that aid in the Beach Boys' classic pop sound, but also showcased not only the leader of the group, Brian Wilson's songwriting, but it defined him as a forward-thinking music producer. To this day, people often ask, who is the 5th Beatle? And while that debate can rage on until the sun disappears into the void of space, I firmly believe that it is George Martin. George Martin's contribution to the Beatles' later output is impossible not to acknowledge or admire. He is single-handedly responsible for a significant portion of the Beatles' orchestral arrangements that propelled the ragtime pop group from not only a household name, but firmly cemented them into the pantheons of rock legend. Not to say that the members of the Beatles can't write orchestral arrangements, as Paul McCartney is no slouch when it comes to doing so, but for the Beatles, in those later years, cooped up in the studio, not touring, it was without a doubt John Lennon, Paul McCartney, George Harrison, Ringo Starr, and George Martin. The Beach Boys didn't have a George Martin. They had Brian Wilson. Brian Wilson was, if I may hyperbolize for a moment, was essentially John, Paul, and George Martin wrapped up into one person. There was no 5th Beach Boy for Pet Sounds. Brian stayed in the studio for months with studio musicians while the rest of the Beach Boys left on tour to promote their newest album at the time. You can listen to cataloged audio of studio sessions of Brian in the control room directing these musicians for hours, giving precise directions and instructions for people playing on anything ranging from a banjo, a clarinet, a guitar, to a fucking tack piano. When Pet Sounds released, it blew people's minds. No pop album had ever come close to sounding as lush, as delicately produced, and as forward-thinking as Pet Sounds. Some even consider it a rough concept album, covering a very specific flow of emotions regarding the LSD counterculture, autobiographical songs, and the front and back end tracks, Wouldn't It Be Nice and Caroline No, being potentially the beginning and the end of a young couple's love. Well, the idea of a concept album wasn't technically really a new thing, as big names had done something in the past, like Frank Sinatra with his album In the Wee Small Hours. The concept of a concept album for something as carefree and adolescent as the Beach Boys was still a pretty new thing. But the funny thing about Pet Sounds is that while even though it was a landmark achievement or considered to be the greatest album of all time, it was really only seen as so in the collective consciousness for about 3 months. In August of 1966, the Beatles, who were the Beach Boys' British invasion rival, released Revolver, which absolutely shocked the world for the band's foray into pure psychedelia, and it primarily focused on studio shenanigans. For example, just the final song on Revolver, Tomorrow Never Knows, utilized 5 separate tape loops that were all manipulated through the song, John Lennon's voice being artificially doubled by using a technique where his vocals were sent through 2 separate tapes, but the second one was slightly delayed. It contained manipulated drum tracks, continuous loop of tape through a tape recorder, among many, many more innovative techniques, all assisted with the aforementioned 5th Beatle. But Brian Wilson wasn't going to go down swinging, and not long after the release of Pet Sounds with the other Beach Boys on tour to promote that album, Brian Wilson would coop himself up in the studio again, this time with lyricist and assistant arranger Van Dyke Parks to work on his next album, which he described as a teenage symphony to God. Good Vibrations, one of their most well-known songs, had come out in October of '66 and was a preview into the window of what SMiLE would sound like. Often referred to as a pocket symphony, Good Vibrations showcased not only the writing talents of Brian Wilson, but his absolute control of the studio. Recorded over the course of 8 months, Brian Wilson crafted and fine-tuned a masterpiece of sunshine psychedelic pop. Over 6 separate sections of music composed of several different interchangeable modules, the song was and still is a revelation to listen to. Whenever I do listen to Good Vibrations, it sounds like a very straightforward pop record, but the more you listen and the more that you delve into the details, the more you realize that there is so much going on at any given second that it's a miracle that it doesn't sound like an awful cacophony. Good Vibrations went on to be the Beach Boys' first million-selling single, as well as their first #1 in Britain. It came out at just the right moment to the burgeoning hippie scene, as well as the explosion of psychedelic records that were just around the corner. But while Good Vibrations topped the charts and revolutionized the art of studio production, Brian Wilson was already underway with the work of his next album, his magnum opus, SMiLE. The Beach Boys simply just didn't really know what they had. Brian Wilson had been working on the album for roughly a year and a half, with the last scheduled recording session being held on May 18th, 1967. And just the very next month, the Beatles released Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. What the Beatles managed to accomplish with that album, with its layers upon layers of studio wizardry assisted by that 5th Beatle, cannot be understated. But I don't think that it's even arguable that Sgt. Pepper's revolutionized pop music forever and firmly cemented the Beatles as a testament to the art of studio craftsmanship and what it could be capable of. But here's the thing. The little thing. A little baby thing. SMiLE was bound to be even more revolutionary and more forward-thinking and so much more intricately crafted than anything the Beatles had made or would make in their entire career. SMiLE, in my opinion, had it been released, would have shifted the landscape of pop music so significantly that I think it's possible that the Beach Boys would be where the Beatles are in the cultural eye and zeitgeist today. The entirety of SMiLE is, generally speaking, one cohesive album. It tells the story of someone's journey across the country to find peace and prosperity in the land that they believe to be a saving grace. SMiLE begins with Our Prayer G and warms you in with its angelic harmonies and promises of bright times to come, and transitions beautifully into the song Heroes and Villains, which was the companion piece to the band's previous single, Good Vibrations. It's just as complex, just as intricate, and in my opinion, showcases the style of SMiLE much stronger than Good Vibrations, as it immediately showcases one of the songwriting touches of the whole album, which is very concrete, distinct, and flourishing sections of songs that at first glance can almost confuse you as to where the songs can start and stop. This can be easily seen as a negative against the album, but to me it's the birth of progressive rock, right here in the recording suites of 1966 with Brian at the helm. This is also the first instance of the album showcasing non-musical bits or fragmented story segments. You can clearly hear a story playing out in the song's lyrics, but the sudden cry of "You're under arrest!" truly implies an underlying story going on beneath the song, so to say. It's a theme that will carry out as the album carries on. SMiLE is so bold in its vision, so eclectic in its maneuverability of instruments, passages, themes, and ideas that no matter how often the album throws completely different sounds, feels, textures, and concepts at you, it never feels out of place enough that you're truly off kilter. Confused for a brief window, maybe, but the harmonies of the Beach Boys are always the guiding light in any of these moments.
Sleep a lot, eat a lot, brush 'em like crazy. Run a lot, do a lot, never be lazy, boy.
SMiLE likely would have contained roughly 19 tracks consisting of 3 movements. The Americana, which is the first section, presents the work, care, and love that was ingrained into the hearts and minds of the idealized Western America that so many people around Brian's age at the time were raised on, but now viewed with the psychedelic tinged angle that the 60s brought the world. The first movement is riddled with children's melodies, playful callbacks to childhood, but also it has this undeniable malevolence between its melodies that often clash with that, and can't help but make the music slightly ominous in its joy. The childhood nostalgia is also a theme that recurs throughout the album, bringing the concept of its concept album nature even further to the forefront, going so far beyond the standard at the time of what a concept album even was. Even the psychedelic classic SF Sorrow by the Pretty Things, which was one of the very first clear and concise narratives in a concept album, was recorded throughout '67 and released in '68. While SMiLE doesn't tell a clear narrative, it was so far ahead of its time in ambition and clarity of that vision that it's almost insane to wrap your head around it. Some songs will last no longer than 30 seconds, only adding personality and life to the greater picture. Movement number 2 in the album is dubbed The Cycle of Life, and in my opinion, this is easily the highlight of the album, as not only does it contain the most conventional songs in one chunk compared to the rest of the album, but those songs in particular are some of the best the Beach Boys ever had to offer. Depending on which version of the album that you're listening to, whether it be the SMiLE sessions from 2011 or Brian Wilson's redone version of the album back from 2004, this Cycle of Life movement has 2 or 3 of the best songs the Beach Boys ever produced, with the likes of Cabin Essence, Wonderful, and Surf's Up. Cabin Essence is genuinely one of the most mind-blowing songs to ever come out of the 1960s, let alone of the entire 20th century. What begins as a silly, jangly little tune suddenly turns into a magnificent choral arrangement with a pulsing beat and an angelic descending melody, only to fall directly back into that innocent jangle, but yet again becomes something so heavenly and so beautiful in its production and composition that its final crescendo and cadence is one that has stuck with me over a decade since first listening to it. Wonderful is another beautiful piece that really exemplifies that vision that Brian Wilson had for the album being a teenage symphony to God. I personally am an atheist, and a pretty hard-grooved one at that, but listening to this song with Brian's clear love and affection for that Heavenly Father, with the lyrics talking about someone being touched, moved, and led by the hand of God himself, despite falling for a non-believer and returning back to her faith, is enough to make me believe, if not only for the time frame of the song. The two songs that follow Wonderful, Look, Song for Children, and Child is Father of the Man, are perfect build-up pieces to the album's crescendo, Surf's Up. Surf's Up is Brian Wilson's masterpiece. The song moves in waves, no pun intended, breathing a relatively simple chord progression, singing about the viewpoint of someone in a grand ballroom and realizing that the world around him, despite the beautiful luxury they're in, is nothing more than a facade, and the song deals with the heartbreak that they experience while they give a toast to those around them. Surf's Up is a song that you just need to hear. It's haunting, it's tragic, it's reflective of a life that has led to everything and yet still brought them nothing. It also brings back a cadence from Child is Father of the Man, which, when I heard that for the first time, it blew my fucking mind. And the fact that this is the Beach Boys, the same band that made Surfin' Safari, Little Deuce Coupe, and Help Me Rhonda, and they're now bringing me one of the most incredible pieces of music that I've ever heard. Even after listening to this album over 200 times by now, Surf's Up never fails to truly astound me and leave me heartbroken. Movement 3 of the album is The Elements. And in my opinion, it's the most interesting, as it's the one that's filled with the most interludes, or at least the ones that feel most like a medley. I think that the whole album ebbs and flows pretty effortlessly, but there is no denying that these last 7 songs of the album are essentially all part of one giant piece, all together, all living and breathing, and truly can't really be listened to without the other. It begins with the pairing of Workshop and Vegetables, which is another fantastic little jolly tune, which brings the tone of the album back down to a playful vibe, because it's a song about eating vegetables, eating candy wrappers, and brushing your teeth and sleeping. Holidays brings us a journey across the sea, into the calm breeze of wind chimes, and thinking about the pain that the past can give, exploding into fire and the horror of the mind, and then casually into Love to Say Da-Da, which is a song that literally sounds like water itself, lost and forgotten inside of a cave, trying to be still, despite knowing that it will never be found. And then the whole album concludes with Good Vibrations, the song that started this whole journey in the first place. SMiLE as a record is one to be experienced if you haven't, and one that I truly believe to be miraculous. Its power continues to defy my expectations every single time that I've listened to it. And despite hearing the album over 30 times while just making this video, I can still say that its songs have lost no power on me. The intricacies of all of these different pieces only continue to amaze me and make me yearn for a world where this album was able to have been released. The world of popular music truly would never have been the same. The Beatles may have been known worldwide for changing the landscape of music, but nearly 3 years before Abbey Road, before the famous medley and the birth of progressive rock, Brian Wilson was in the studio, away from his bandmates, and crafting the best album that never would be, and the album that would have defined the 1960s. So what happened Why wasn't SMiLE finished? What prevented this potential masterpiece from seeing the light of day? Well, the complicated parts are really lost to time, as the stories between the members of the band and even Van Dyke Parks himself tend to vary wildly between different retellings of the series of events. But the easy part, and what we know for sure, is that when the Beach Boys got back to the studio after touring for Pet Sounds, despite vocals being put on a vast majority of the songs, there was a point where the tensions between the group started to flare up. It was likely either from them not fully appreciating what Brian had been doing, thinking that the songs just weren't very good, or Brian Wilson just began to feel the pressure of getting the album done and began to crumble under the weight of that burden. He began to doubt himself and was never fully reciprocated by his bandmates to see the end of his vision. What has lasted in the following decades is a series of random bootlegs, some completed songs showing up on subsequent Beach Boys albums, and a lasting legacy that up until 2004 with Brian Wilson Presents SMiLE was something that people could only imagine. With the release of the SMiLE sessions in 2011, it was closer to that realized vision with the actual Beach Boys appearing on the album songs, but it was never, or will never be, that album that was cancelled. What makes the SMiLE sessions so heartbreaking to me is hearing just how close it was to completion. I remember hearing the compilation back when it was new and thinking that they could honestly have just put this out as is, and it still would have blown people away. But even more tragic than that is the 2004 version that Brian Wilson made. It's not even that much different than the compilation. It's more full, sure, a couple of more songs are a bit more fleshed out, but, and I mean this sincerely, if the Beach Boys probably had like another month, or 2 at the most, SMiLE would have been finished. But it wasn't. And what was eventually published in 2011 under the SMiLE Sessions moniker, only Brian Wilson back in the 60s could have finalized what was recorded back then. And Brian Wilson's 2004 versions is as close to the original vision as it probably would have been, isn't the Beach Boys version of SMiLE. And what this ends up making SMiLE by proxy is an album that is malleable. One that is as much owned by the fans as much as it is Brian Wilson. If you do even a little bit of searching on YouTube, you'll find fan edits and fan versions all compiled together showing their own personal vision for what the album would have sounded like. I've heard professional sounding edits, AI assisted edits, full-on covers, versions in the Super Mario 64 sound font, just to name a few. And it says something not only to the power of the mystique that this album holds over music fans, but the power of the music inside it. Unlike Dark Side or Purple Rain or Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, among all of the other albums that I named at the beginning of this video, those albums have a start and a stop. A moment where the artist behind those records said, "That's enough," and put it out for the world. SMiLE doesn't have that, nor will it ever. This album is alive. One that can be a first-time listen and blow your mind basically whenever you want it to. And I think that there is something to be said about recapturing the magic of a piece of art that you love. It's what many works of art fail to achieve because you've likely engaged with ones that you love a countless number of times, or at least to the point where those initial feelings have been dulled to some extent. You know the twists, you know the mechanics, you felt the feelings and heard the melodies to the point where it can no longer surprise you. But SMiLE still can. It can still throw a curveball at you. It can surprise you with a new transition into a song, or take you off guard with a completely different track listing. SMiLE can be there as a teenage symphony to God, or as whatever you want it to be. And in the cancellation of album, SMiLE became something different. But it will always be there whenever you need it, in whatever form you desire it to be in. And I promise you that no matter which version of the album that you decide to listen to, it will still do what it has always promised to do. Make you smile.
tomato is a fruit, but it's also a vegetable.